What if empathy isn't just emotional intelligence, but a socially acceptable form of telepathy? Both happen instantly, without intention, without effort, and there's no signal that you can just point to. There's no mechanism. When one person enters an internal state, the other just reflects that same state instantly. Distance does not seem to matter. Awareness does not seem to matter. So what would you call that? If it involves emotions, we call it empathy. But if it involves thought, we call it telepathy. But what if the underlying process is exactly the same? Because in this episode, I want to explore the possibility that empathy isn't separate from telepathy at all. It's just the version that we deem acceptable. We usually think of empathy as the way that someone feels. And we usually think of telepathy as just science fiction, mind reading, something that humans just simply cannot do. Those ideas live very far apart in our heads. But what if they're actually not that far apart in practice? What if empathy is what telepathy looks like when it isn't about thoughts, but when it's about states? Not words or images, just the internal condition that someone is in. And think about how quickly it happens. Someone walks into a room and you feel it immediately. When someone is anxious around you, your body tightens without even them saying a word. Sometimes you don't even realize what changed, but your body keeps the score. You didn't decide to feel that way. You didn't have to sit there and analyze it. Your nervous system just picked it up automatically. And that's the part that I'm interested in. Because if empathy was just about imagination or logic, it wouldn't feel automatic. It wouldn't show up in your breathing, in the way that your chest hangs, or in your stomach. So in this episode, I'm not trying to argue that telepathy is real in the way that movies portray it to be. And I'm not talking about thoughts jumping from one brain to another. I'm asking something quieter. What if empathy already involves some sort of shared signal? And what if our nervous systems are just tuning into it? And what if the only reason we don't call it telepathy is because it happens all the time? That's what I want to explore. So I'm going to ask you to suspend your disbelief for a second. Imagine if every one of your emotional states is a sine wave, and there's also varying degrees of that emotion and the depth of that sine wave. For example, sadness might look like this. Anxiety may look like that. Grief, which is a form of sadness, may look like this. You're walking around the world transmitting these frequencies that you can't see and have not been measured by science yet. Everyone has the capability of empathy, some people more than others. What if the people that we call empaths have this very special and unique ability without thinking about it to just match the same frequency that you're feeling? And when that happens, it allows the empath to completely envelop themselves in the emotion that the other person is feeling. So this thought brought up some pretty deep and personal questions for me. So I wanted to look to see what the latest science says about how we understand how empathy works. And I think it's going to surprise you. Neuroscientists don't treat empathy as a single skill. They describe it as at least two interacting systems. The first is cognitive empathy. That's your ability to infer what someone else might be thinking or feeling. When people talk about empathy, this is usually what they mean. But there's a second system, affective empathy. That's when your nervous system reacts as if you're sharing part of another person's internal state. Your body responds before you consciously think about it. This is sometimes called shared pain or vicarious pain. There are documented cases where partners of pregnant women report pain, nausea, or physical discomfort during pregnancy and even labor, not because anything is physically happening to them, but because their nervous system is mirroring the experience. And we didn't uncover this through philosophy. We uncovered this through brain imaging. Empathy just doesn't live in one single spot of the brain. It's the result of several systems working together. The insula helps you feel what's happening inside your body. The cingulate cortex adds emotional weight and urgency, and the tempoparietal junction helps you tell the difference between you and someone else. When these systems are in balance, empathy feels natural. And when they're not, empathy can quickly become overwhelming. We've identified the brain regions, we've captured the images, and we've mapped the activity. But if you ask what's actually happening at a microscopic level, how one person's internal state becomes another person's experience, the answer gets a lot less clear. So here's the part that matters. When scientists were first starting to study empathy, they weren't trying to explain it. They were trying to see it. That's where Sir Peter Mansfield enters the picture. He's the guy that co-invented the MRI.
Dr. Mansfield managed to take a picture across the inside of a finger. Now he's constructed this monster magnet, big enough for him to build up pictures anywhere inside the human body. The guinea pig for the first test was Dr. Mansfield himself. This band will pick up signals from inside his body. His technique depends on two facts: that our bodies are made up mostly of water, and that water molecules react when subjected to a strong magnetic field.
So they put people in scanners, they showed them other people that were in pain, and they noticed something that was consistent. Certain networks of the brain worked together. Across subjects, across experiments, it was all the same results. And that was enough to say that something real and valid is happening here inside the brain. But knowing where something happens is vastly different from understanding how something happens. And if you drill down all the way to the neurons and synapses, down to the fabric of what makes our brain, we still don't fully understand how one person's experience can become someone else's internal state. In other words, we can measure the footprint, but we can't measure the construction of the footprint. So how does all this tie into telepathy? Well, in the last decade, neuroscientists started doing something pretty radical. Instead of scanning one brain at a time, they started to scan two brains at a time. This is called hyperscanning. Two people talk, two people collaborate, or just two people sit in silence. And what researchers noticed surprised them. The two brains that they were studying started to synchronize. And I'm not talking like metaphorically, I'm talking literally. Certain rhythms aligned, timing patterns locked in. Neural activity started to mirror across separate brains. This is not science fiction. This synchronization has been observed with musicians playing together, between teachers and students, romantic partners, and therapists and patients. I can say personally that I have experienced this. I never knew what it was called, but I used to be in a band, probably like a decade ago now. And while writing a song with a friend of mine, time just seems to slip away and reality dissolves into nothingness and everything all at once. And especially with improv music, when you're just trying to find a new part to a song, person A starts playing a riff or a chord progression, and the other person plays a part that just magically fits. But here's the important part. We don't know how that coordination happens. It's still a complete mystery. As far as we can tell, there's no signal being passed between the brains. There's obviously no wire, but there's no transmitter. There's no mechanism that anyone can just point to. So we can see the effect and we can measure the alignment, but the actual process is still very much unclear. Does that sound familiar to you? Because this is the start of where empathy and telepathy rhyme. It's the same gap, but different tolerances. And that is frustrating. Science often measures phenomena well before it can explain how it works. And explanation tends to follow observation, not the other way around. So the obvious question is, has science ever tried to study telepathy in the same way? And the answer is, yes, they have. Just not in the way that most people imagine. There is no map of the telepathic brain. There are no regions that you can point to and say, that's the telepathic region. But researchers have tried to study and measure what happens inside the brain when people claim that they're experiencing telepathic abilities. Most of that work has used EEG, not fMRI. That's mostly because EEG is better at capturing timing and rhythms and synchronization. In other words, not just where it's happening in the brain, but when it's happening in the brain. In these experiments, researchers looked for things like changes in brainwave patterns, unexpected correlations between two people, or shifts in neural activity during sending and receiving periods. And they have found anomalies, just like in the hyperscanning example. Patterns that were difficult to explain by chance alone. And this is the key point. They could not find a mechanism. They could not find a repeatable neural pattern. And they did not find anything that clearly explained how information would move from one brain to another. So minus the part about finding where in the brain this happens, it's just like empathy. So what has been observed then? Well, in 2018, researchers led by Powell Goldstein led a very interesting experiment. They brought romantic partners into a lab, and one partner was exposed to very minor physical pain, and the other partner sat nearby. Sometimes they were allowed to hold hands, and other times they weren't. Meanwhile, both of their brains were simultaneously being scanned using EEG. Now, here's what they found. When the partners held hands during the pain stimulus, their brain activities started to synchronize. Specific neural rhythms, particularly in the alpha mu frequency band, began to align. And the more empathetically accurate the observing partner was, meaning the better that they can track and understand the other person's experience, the stronger the neural synchrony became. And here's the part that is actually insane. The stronger the synchrony, the more the person in pain felt relief. Let that sink in for a second. Two separate brains, two separate nervous systems, aligning in measurable ways during shared emotion, and that alignment correlated with reduced pain. This isn't mysticism, this is neuroscience. Here's another important boundary. In that study, the partners were touching, right? But they weren't allowed to see each other. So what the researchers recorded was coordination, not quite telepathy. But what it did do is it changed the question. If we can measure synchrony during touch, what happens when you remove the touch? And what happens when you remove sight? And what happens when you remove all other sensory pathways? That's where something called the Ganzfeld experiments comes into play. Starting in the 1970s and refined in the 1980s and 90s, researchers designed a protocol specifically to test telepathy under controlled conditions. Here's how it worked. A receiver would sit in a state of sensory homogenization, eyes covered with translucent halves of ping pong balls, white noise in their ears, minimal external stimulation. A sender would be set up in a completely different room with a randomly selected picture or video that they're looking at. The receiver's job was really simple. Describe any impressions that just came to mind. Later, they were shown 4 possible targets, and they were asked which one of these 4 best described their experience and the visions that they saw. Simple math tells us that chance in a 4-part task is 25%. In the 1990s, psychologist Charles Honorton and colleagues reported hit rates hovering around 32% across hundreds of sessions. Not that big of a deal, right? That's not huge, but it is above chance. Critics argued about randomization procedures, about judging methods, about subtle leakage, about publication bias. And to this day, that debate continues. This happened before in science with the microscope and bacteria. People knew that infections were spreading. The patterns were obvious. But when they looked with the tools they had, they didn't find anything. So the conclusion wasn't, well, I guess we just don't have the right tool yet. It was, there's nothing here. This theory is bunk. And how did that turn out? Enter the telepathy tapes. For those of you that have been maybe living under a rock, over the last few years there's been a new podcast called The Telepathy Tapes with host Kai Dickens, and featuring the Harvard-trained psychiatrist and neuroscientist, Dr. Diane Hennacy Powell. This podcast has been a complete game changer and swept the world with its claim of highly autistic, nonverbal children having a telepathic connection to their parents. But what makes the telepathy tapes worth paying attention to is the fact that they're not trying to follow the same methodologies as those in the past. They're trying to look at the problem differently. Instead of asking, can we detect telepathy with the tools we already have? They're asking, what if we're using the wrong tools altogether? The people involved aren't approaching it like a magic trick. They're approaching it like it's an anomaly. And with the understanding that if something real is happening here, it may not show up in the way that we're expecting it to. But the proof is in the pudding, right? I don't even know what that saying means, to be honest, but we're going to roll with it. Take a look at this clip from the telepathy tapes. It features a highly autistic child who seems to be maybe in his teens. His mother is holding up a tablet with a random word generator on it. She clicks the button on the tablet that generates a new random word. And pay close attention to the autistic child's eyes. He's looking down. He's in his own world. He's not paying attention to anyone or anything. And almost immediately on his tablet, he spells out the word exactly. It's actually incredible.
Okay, random number generator, word generator, go for it.
P A T T E Pat.
Good. She showed up to me, Manisha. Hold on, let me zoom in. And get focus here. Stand by. Good. Good. Nice. Okay, you can go, Michael. And then I'll show the whole room here. No one back here. No one here.
Now, for this episode, I reached out to almost a dozen neuroscientists, those that specialize in the science of empathy, to come onto this podcast and share their knowledge with us. I was transparent with them and I told them what this episode is about. Many of them respectfully declined, citing that they were working on books or just engulfed in research. Fair enough. Others just didn't reply at all. Now, is that because this channel is small and we talk about some crazy things sometimes? It could be. I want to reiterate that Dr. Powell is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and neuroscientist. Her background is in medicine, neuroscience, and autism research, not paranormal investigation. For years, she studied savant abilities and atypical cognition in nonverbal adults. In other words, she studied people whose brains already challenge our assumptions about how information is processed and expressed. That's why her involvement here is significant. All she's really doing is just documenting anomalies, cases where behavior doesn't just neatly line up with expectations. She chooses her words very intently. Just listen how she speaks about it.
Although we were told that these things were evidence of mental illness, these are things that have been reported by people across time, across cultures. And I knew that our model for understanding the brain and consciousness was seriously incomplete. That it's just a large assumption on the part of neuroscience that the brain's what creates consciousness. And I also was aware of theoretical physics because I took a fair amount of physics as an undergraduate. I found it interesting, and I have a brother who's a theoretical physicist. And we'd have conversations about consciousness and about, so for example, some of the conversations between Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli about synchronicities and how there's really this world that quantum physicists and various mystics from the East would discuss, and it really implied that some of these phenomena actually were not only possible but maybe even likely to occur, at least occasionally.
I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm on a seesaw with this whole telepathy thing. Before I started this channel, I used to think telepathy was a joke for all the reasons I outlined here. And then I heard the telepathy tapes, and that sucked me right back in. New evidence, amazing stories. It almost felt like a novel version of telepathy. Something that I could wrap my brain around. I was all in. And then I was smashed right back down into reality when I saw Oz the Mentalist on Joe Rogan. For those of you that don't know, Oz is a mentalist, which is essentially another name for a magician. He's honed his skills in deceiving people, and he can do some amazing things. For example, during his episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, he was actually able to guess Joe Rogan's debit PIN number.
It's weird, but statistically, men will lie bigger, women smaller. Men like to lie by saying things are bigger, right? No shocker.
Okay.
So I don't think, I would tell you right off the jump for me, that means that your first number, you don't have to say anything yet, I wrote 2020, is smaller. That's what most people do when they're rushed. If I had given you 5 minutes, you would have done this different.
No, I wouldn't have.
No, you would have.
Why would I have?
Because you would have thought about it, and then people go down a different path.
Nope.
No?
Nope.
Okay, worked out for me either way. You'll be honest if I'm right.
Okay.
I got a hit, which means it's a 0 or 1. I think the first number of your code's a 1, isn't it? Your real PIN code.
My ATM
PIN code.
Why would I tell you that on the air?
Should I only show this to you?
Sure.
Only show it to you.
Yeah.
Can we acquiesce that the first number I got was correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you did repetition. So yeah, I like the fact when people always say to me it's fake when they watch the videos, they're like, you must have set up. Joe doesn't even want this to happen right now. He had no idea this was going to happen. You used 2 numbers in repeats. What that means is you probably did the same thing. You also didn't use any of the same numbers. So I know there's not a 2, a 0, or a 2 in it. I don't think so either. Mm-hmm. And I'm watching you while I say it. You put the hand up. You might as well have said yes to me out loud. So now I know. Think of the second number,
Okay.
third number, fourth number.
Got it.
Every time you did it, it's a data point.
Okay.
I'm only going to ask you one more question. I'm not looking for answers. The last number is the biggest, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm showing this to you. Is there a camera behind me? I don't want to make sure. I'm only going to show it to you. It's not 2020. How'd I do, Joe? Is that your ATM PIN code?
Yeah. That's weird.
He claims to be able to do this via like microtransactions or these very nuanced tells that the person has with their body language. It's incredible to watch, and it feels like telepathy. So naturally, Joe Rogan asked him about the telepathy tapes and telepathy with these highly autistic, nonverbal children. And Oz's response shattered every confidence that I had that telepathy was real. Here was someone that seems to possess the skills of telepathy, and he himself is saying it's not it. So I was right back where I started. There's no way that telepathy could be real, right? Well, that all changed about a week ago prior to this recording. This part is honestly kind of hard to talk about. A coworker came up to me about a week ago and told me about how her mother-in-law has stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and it's terminal. She actually lives with her husband and 2 young kids. I'll spare you the details, but it was a short conversation, about maybe 2 minutes in length. But within milliseconds of her explaining the situation to me, I felt like I had pancreatic cancer. I was in the desolate hallways. I was in the waiting rooms. I was getting that horrible treatment. I felt it in my soul. And simultaneously, I also felt what it would be like to live with someone that has a terminal disease like that. Waking up and seeing their face, seeing them deteriorate. And all at the same time, I felt what it was like to be a kid growing up and seeing your grandmother go through something horrible. It wrecked me, if I'm being honest. this isn't the first time this sort of thing has happened in my life. I've always felt empathy very deep. So I did what anyone would do in the situation, and I talked about it with close friends and family, one of them being Josh. And after Josh told me that that's a feature that he loves about me, that I care so deeply, he came up with this idea. It's something that's been circling around in his brain for a very long time. The idea that when we feel very strong emotions, our bodies are reverberating at a certain frequency. And within milliseconds, empaths automatically match the same frequency as that person feeling that emotion. In other words, it's the frequency that's causing the emotion, and it can be replicated, like you're tuning into it. And it was his idea that what if telepathy works the same way? When we think about things, those thoughts have a vibration, a vibe, if you will, that someone else can pick up on and not necessarily hear the thoughts, but understand what those thoughts mean, an understanding. It's like a universal consciousness. And that idea has been thrown around for a long time now, that our brains are not transmitters of consciousness, but receivers. And there's this unifying field of consciousness that we just simply tap into. I'm not going to go into that now. Maybe that's another episode. But I do find it really funny and kind of ironic that it took me 39 years on this planet to admit to myself, and now the internet, that I'm an empath. And it makes all the sense in the world. So think of this episode like the beginning chapter of a book. I want to formally invite any neuroscientist, psychiatrist, or researcher of empathy to reach out to me. I want to talk to you because we need your help. I want to help remove the stigma behind these topics like telepathy. But I can't help but admit that there's this burning fire in my stomach that tells me that we're on the right path here. And if I'm wrong, I'll admit that I'm wrong. But there seems to be a through line, a loose thread, and I intend to pull on it. So the next time that you feel someone else's pain inside your own chest, ask yourself, is that empathy? Or is it the edge of something that we just don't quite understand yet?